Hello to everyone. It's like really, really lovely to have the opportunity to have this conversation with Helena today and to have all of you. We started a discussion with Helena a couple of months ago when we were at an event on Wilton Park in the UK. And we thought, well, this is super relevant. Why don't we just bring some of these ideas that we are discussing in the framework of this event in relation to climate and conflict to the Anticipation Hub. So it's just like great that we made it happen. And thank you so much, Helena, for joining. So just to get started, a little bit about of background about myself. So I'm Catalina Jaime. I'm the head of the climate and conflict team at the Climate Center. I'm also finishing a PhD on anticipatory action in conflict settings. And I was an IPCC contributor author on the topic of adaptation in conflict contexts, and as well one of the founders of the Anticipation Hub. So I'm just like very excited, that we can do this type of activities. And with me today, we have Helena de Jong, who is the head of the COP28 Declaration on Relief, Recovery, and Peace. And it is just so exciting, to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you, Helena, because we want to unpack a lot of the build up of this declaration and why this is so important for the anticipatory action community. So just a few words about Helena, which I'm very excited. I was looking at her profile and I just find it fascinating. Like Helena pretty much has worked all her life on really looking at the protection of people affected by conflict, and I really looking at the role of peace building within humanitarian operations. And I actually found, Helena, an interesting fact. You and me were in the Nepal in 2009 at the same time. Yeah, I found that out earlier. I was like, oh, this is quite exciting. What a coincidence. And I was also working when I was in Nepal. I was working on topics related to climate and conflict at that time. So we have something in common there. So tell us a little bit about you. I mean, what in your career led you to be the head of this very important declaration?
Thank you so much, Catalina. And that's a nice coincidence. Very nice that you found that out. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And good morning or afternoon to those of you joining us online. So yes, I have indeed been focusing for most of my career on protection of civilians, on local perceptions of communities affected by conflict, and fragility in terms of their security perceptions, in terms of their primarily human security experiences. And I've started basically my career with NGOs in the Netherlands, which was also how I ended up working in Nepal for a little while. And then coincidentally actually became the project manager of a project that also had a disaster risk reduction and management component. And that combination actually led me to join the UN Climate Security Mechanism in 2019, which was really new at the time. It was just a topic that was slowly starting to pop up, the linkages between climate change, peace, and security. So that's where this all came from, basically. So I worked with the Climate Security Mechanism, the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, for quite some time, 3.5 years. And then COP28 decided that they wanted to have a strong focus on the climate, peace, and security linkage in obviously the COP28 context. And they basically approached me and asked me if I wanted to become part of that effort, which was really, really excited. It was very new. And that's how I ended up in this position.
That is so great to hear. Like when you were saying, a couple of things, it resonates so much with my career as well. Or how I, in a way, not did a lot of disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation, but also always with that kind of underlying focus on conflict affected communities. And so it's just really, it's so lovely. I feel that we should have met many, many years ago. So it's great that we meet now. So it's like, yeah, fantastic. So now let's go into the declaration, because I know many of you would be very interested to hear a little bit about the story behind the declaration, and what is this about, and why it's so important, and how this connects with anticipatory action in general. So a little bit of the background, and also if you have any questions, just put it on the chat, because we really want to make sure that we address any, questions that you have. If you want to have any remarks, just put it on the chat. So a little bit of the background, like this declaration is something quite remarkable in the context of COP. This is the first time ever that there is really a focus on that interlinkage between climate change and conflict in the context of COP. Never ever before, really, like at this very strategic level. And it really has this very strong focus of like how we as like humanity and all these different communities can help to advance policy, can help to advance like finances and like practice to be able to support people that are affected by fragility and conflict and violence, and that are really in this intersection of like multiple like compound and cascading hazards. So it's like quite an special like process, because it's just so urgent and it's so necessary to have at that very high level. So a little bit of the story behind this, because I think it's a very beautiful story of like how did we get here. So a couple of years ago, and there are many multiples stories, so I'm going to tell you the part of my story that I'm very aware about. You can complement, Helena, your part as well. But basically, a couple of years ago, different organizations under the leadership of the ICRC, with the World Bank, as well like Mercy Corps, UNHCR, and many others, including the Climate Center, we got together in this very informal working group, trying to think, okay, how can we advance climate action for people affected by conflict? There is a gap, we need to do something. So we had a series of conversations and discussions, and are trying to advance particular specific key messages that we could like move forward. So through that process that was relatively informal, a couple of years ago, little by little, everything started to move strongly at that political level, to the point that this informal group has been now make a little bit more formal through a coalition called the Coalition of Climate Action in Fragile and Conflict and Violent Settings. And that, I would say, was one of these pushing factors to be able to move the declaration like forward. So I think this is just really nice story to kind of like show how, from an idea that you will believe out, this is not gonna, like get necessarily to a COP declaration, actually happened. So it is quite a beautiful process. So now with that background, I would love, Helena, you can share with all of us, why do you think this declaration is important? Why is bringing to the people that need it the most, to the different organizations that are trying to push for this agenda, what makes you excited about it?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much. And you're so right, because we build a lot on the work that this specific coalition did. There was a lot of preparation work that basically paved the way for 28 presidency to move forward on this declaration. So this is basically, we started with the idea we want to do something related to climate action in fragile and conflict affected communities. This was really a priority of the UAE presidency. But then the question, of course, is what exactly are you going to do in the context of a COP, which focuses on climate change? And there was limited, some openness, but also fairly limited appetite in discussing the specific focus on fragility, insecurity, because it is still perceived as something that should be addressed by the Security Council and not necessarily in the context of the COP. Although we see a lot of movement in that space, the Security Council addressing climate risks, and the COP space now also increasingly addressing fragility and conflict-related issues. So what we basically did was we embarked on a long consultation process with all the different organizations and stakeholders that we thought should have a voice in determining what we wanted to do at COP28. So we spoke with the multilateral development banks, with local civil society, with governments from fragile and conflict-affected contexts, with climate finance providers, the multilateral climate funds. And we worked very closely with a couple of coalitions of organizations that were already very active in this space in terms of determining what are the issues, what are some of the barriers of providing climate action and climate finance to fragile and conflict-affected settings, and what, of course, are also some of the solutions that we see in this space. And they really all told us very similar things. They said, this is an issue. There are super big barriers for climate finance to flow into fragile and conflict-affected contexts, specifically the least developed countries, but also to some extent small island developing states have fairly, and those that are affected by fragility and conflict specifically, and actually almost half of the LDCs is affected by fragility or conflict. But then when you really look into it, you see that they hardly receive any support in terms of climate action and finance. So sometimes conflict-affected countries receive like 80 times less climate finance than other more stable developing countries. So the more fragile a context is, the more vulnerable to climate change as well. And these are like interconnected issues. The less finance and support it receives in adapting to climate change and addressing loss and damage. So this was the problem that we were grappling with. And what all of these actors also told us was that we really need to put a spotlight on this focus at COP28. So how can you do that? The negotiations were too complicated to put that on the table. And it's also, yeah, we didn't really want to go there, and that was also the advice that we got from all the consultations. But as the COP presidency, you also have the opportunity to spotlight and highlight particular topics in the context of the action agenda. So that's what we decided to do. And that's where the idea of a declaration came from. So we really try to include as much as possible the issues that we heard from the consultations in a declaration, a political declaration, which eventually ended up being endorsed by 93 governments and 43 organizations, a really broad variety of actors that were supportive of effort. And it focuses on accelerating finance to fragile and conflict-affected communities. It focuses on programming and good practice. And this, I think, is a very clear connection to anticipatory action and early warning efforts. And of course, also on collaboration and partnerships. So what was really exciting behind this, behind all of this, was that this really put political momentum and political focus on this issue in the context of the COP, and that we managed to bring a lot of different actors together around this issue. So not just the peace-building actors who traditionally were a bit more focused on this, but also really the finance providers and some of the key governments as well.
Super. I mean, you were mentioning about, one of the things that led to all this was that understanding of the gaps on climate finances and just lack of adaptation. When the IPCC report, the AR6, was in the process to, be drafted, like one of my colleagues, actually, Erin Coughlin-Perez, who was one of the lead authors of Chapter 17, who works very closely with me on my research on anticipatory action in conflict, thought about, okay, why don't we do an analysis of, at the end, what is the adaptation that is happening or not? So there was this absolutely fascinating process in the context of the IPCC to do a systematic review of all the adaptation efforts that were happening in conflict-affected context, like the biggest, basically, systematic review ever done on this. And some of the things, basically, what we found out clearly is that there is just not enough. There is just, it was very clear that it was very fragmented. There were some countries in conflict that had more investments, but the majority didn't. But then another very interesting element that we found out is that even in a country, because we cannot put one country in a single basket, no, because you can have one country, like my country, Colombia, where you can have adaptation investments in the safe areas, But on the very dangerous areas, then you don't have anything. So it's very complicated as well, to understand if climate finances that are supposed to be, target to central countries actually reach the most complex areas. And I think that's one of the biggest like gaps. So could you tell us a little bit more about, those challenges? Like, what is those challenges that we need to overcome to be able to bring climate action to these contexts?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the key challenges indeed, because those countries, it's not like every single community is facing the same issue in a particular country. Some of the other things that we really heard from the consultations was a lack of capacity, and not just a lack of capacity in terms of implementing finance on the part of the government, just because they obviously have other priorities to deal with, or there are changes in the government structure, or people have simply left the country, people with climate skills, but also very much the capacity on the part of funders to know, like, what do we need to adjust and adapt in our specific procedures to really ensure that the most vulnerable are receiving the support that they need. Because what you usually see is that these are like big amounts of money for big infrastructure projects that are not very targeted and very applicable for communities in fragile and conflict affected communities. So really this capacity, the perception of risk is also something that we really heard a lot, because sometimes from the funder side, there's already a perspective of, okay, this country, not a particular segment of the country or a particular area, is suffering from conflict. So the risks are too high for our investment in this conflict. There's too much that can go wrong. We need to adhere to our social and environmental safeguards, and that's just not possible. So some of the solutions that we also heard, because I do think it's very important to emphasize that there are certain solutions. And one of them is increasing flexibility in terms of the procedures on the funder side. So there is an opportunity really for funders to look at their own procedures and policies, to adjust them, to allow for greater flexibility, to look very specifically at the risks that are actually there, not just at the risks that are perceived to be there, and then see, maybe we can start with a smaller amount of funding. Maybe we can work closer together with some of the local organizations that are already very active in this space. So there are certain ways to alleviate, but these were definitely some of the barriers that we kept on hearing. And a lot of frustration also from government actors, but also civil society active in fragile and conflict affected areas, who said, look, we don't have access. It takes us 5 to 7 years to get any type of funding. It's actually very costly to develop a project proposal in the first place. So there are lots of barriers, but luckily also a few solutions.
Totally. And that actually makes me think about something really good that just happened. And I think it's one of those milestones where I see that, I mean, in a way, the declaration and a lot, what is happening at political level is making a difference. So, but you probably know, like Mafalda Duarte from the head of the Green Climate Fund was in Somalia very recently, like a couple of months ago. And I think that was such a bold statement of just being there with, the prime minister, and then just trying to figure out, okay, how the Green Climate Fund can change a little bit the way of working to be able to support the government of Somalia and many other governments. And then that actually, I just even got the really great news by the climate envoy of the office of the Prime Minister of Somalia, telling me that GCF has allocated an amount of money for Somalia just recently through FAO. So this is like a big, that it's something is happening. I think that is really like a really good move that kind of give us some hope that, things will change. Which leads me to another question I wanted to ask you that is more about the progress. So we had declaration, super, exciting, so many like partners and governments committed. And now we are heading to Azerbaijan very soon. And of course, Brazil is going to be like a really important milestone as well for COP. So I mean, what is the progress that you see? Like, what are these key milestones that make you feel like, okay, like we're going into a good direction?
Yeah, so it's definitely a long-term effort, but we do indeed see some really good progress being made already, including by indeed Green Climate Fund's visit to Somalia and the allocation of dedicated finance for Somalia. So what we've been trying to do is bring different communities together. So very much in the spirit of the coalition, the interagency coalition that you managed or that you mentioned in the beginning, Catalina. But now we were trying to bring some of the different sectors together for conversations. So what we did, we focused quite strongly on finance because that resonates within the context of the COP. And there's a lot of momentum in that space. So just recently, just last month, we brought a lot of representatives from the multilateral climate funds, the multilateral development banks, and a few governments together in Abu Dhabi to really dive into this issue of climate finance to fragile and conflict affected areas and to find solutions, basically, because we've seen a lot of attention on the barriers that we just discussed as well. But what concretely can the climate funds do together? What concretely can the MDBs do together? And there was quite a lot of concrete stuff that was coming out of that conversation. So really a lot of momentum in terms of like, and discussion, can we do something like soft targets in terms of like looking at the portfolio of the different climate funds and identifying which countries are currently being left behind, basically, who are the countries that are not knocking on the doors of the vertical climate funds. And is there an opportunity for the climate funds to then proactively approach them to ensure that there is a process that also enables them to even benefit from readiness funding to begin with? Or can they align around accreditation procedures? Can they streamline some of these complicated processes that governments have to go through in terms of applying for these funds in the first place? So that's one of the efforts that we are undertaking. As I said, it's pretty long-term effort. And we're doing the same actually on a few thematic issues. So we're looking also specifically at food security. So we're working very closely together with the Rome-based agencies on identifying what can we do in terms of programming of food security efforts and interlinked climate initiatives in fragile and conflicted contexts. So those are just a few examples of like really like trying to figure out what are the concrete things that we can take. And one of the efforts that we've also launched is the launch of a relief, recovery, and peace coordination mechanism, because we're very conscious of the fact that the COP28 presidency is, of course, like handing over to COP29 Azerbaijan, but we really want to sustain this effort and keep the political momentum and the progress on the declaration going. So we've brought together ODI, the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy, who are based in Abu Dhabi, and the G7 group of conflict-affected countries, so the secretariat of that group. And they are now forming this coordination mechanism to work with all the different working groups, so with the finance group, with the food security group, hopefully also with a group of anticipatory action related experts, to push these objectives further ahead towards COP29, but also very much towards COP30 and beyond.
I'm super excited about that. So I'm gonna be coordinating some of the working groups. So I'm gonna be out working with ODI to figure it out. Like, but I really like that there's gonna be this kind of like understanding risk, like sort of like working group. And so yeah, so I think it's such a good timing to just get more concrete and like, okay, what has been done and what can we do? And I think this aligned very nicely with the coalition as well. So yeah, I think the momentum is there. And maybe from a practical perspective, I could also share that I see the changes happening from a humanitarian perspective. A lot of organizations particularly those ones that look at protection of populations affected by conflict, like being the ICRC or NRC, or like all these that are traditional more kind of like conflict-oriented organizations. I think it's fascinating that there is this shift of like mindset of thinking, okay, how can we, through our operations, through the work that we do, can also support people affected by conflict with climate action. So it's like we are in a really interesting turning point, even within the humanitarian sector, how to enhance the work that we are doing. And in my case, I'm very close to the work of the ICRC because I lead the global partnership of the ICRC for the integration of climate risk within all their operations. And I see like how amazing delegations are starting to think, okay, well, how can I anticipate better? How can I use weather forecast, which was the thing that they necessarily didn't do before. So I think, yeah, so I think that the momentum is quite positive. It would be great if anybody on that is here with us have any examples of, how you see the progress of like really bringing climate action to populations affected by conflict, and maybe on the space of anticipatory action specifically. It would be great if you put it on the chat so we can unpack some of your feedback as well. So with that, let's dive into the anticipatory action like space, because at the moment we are talking more, generally climate action, which is the whole basically time scale, like long-term investments, like the robust risk reduction efforts that are needed. And I think within that big umbrella, then anticipatory action fits into that, like that space of like how through that use of like forecast and risk analysis, we could be better at what we call outsmarting disasters. Like how can we really act before it, and in particular in the context of like conflict and violence and fragility. I mean, how do we navigate that really like severe underlying vulnerabilities that are given because of the context, and on top of it, the potential of a flood or a heat wave, a drought, and so on. So let's dive into this. So with that, I just give you a quick background of where we are in this space. So when we created the Anticipation Hub, actually, at that time, the idea of how to advance early warning and early action for populations affected by conflict was little. It was, we also started to have those conversations because most of our work, particularly in the humanitarian sector, was focused on the areas that were easy to access in a way. That was kind of like the priority of our anticipatory action agenda. But at that point, back in 2019, we realized there is a big gap. Like we need to figure it out. How do we actually do anticipatory action in some of the most complex like contexts? And that's why we created a working group that is super active in the hub. We have so many different like partners, like more than 50 partners that join like conversations about, for example, how can we advance anticipatory action for displaced populations that have been affected by conflict? Also, a lot of interest even on that intersection of like conflict prediction, or that intersection of like how do we anticipate conflict, but how can I also anticipate complex crises that are kind of like intertwined between climate impacts and conflict. So we have a lot of these like deep, interesting conversations on this topic. So over the years, what I have seen is that definitely there has been a big shift of many institutions of like trying to set up these systems like more and more with elements of like conflict sensitivity, with elements of like how do we make sure that safety and security and like protocols are well set up to be able to support these areas. So there is little by little like a really interesting like shift. Yet it is not at the scale. Like yet we know that there are like places like if you look at certain areas of like Mali that are where security concerns are very high, it's just extremely difficult to really be able to do early action. Like it's just not necessarily happening. So there is a lot more that we need to do, and that is from a financial perspective. And going back, Helena, to what you were saying, I mean, the lack of funds is like very, very clear, and particularly for setting up these early warning, early action mechanisms, not necessarily for the action itself, but to set up the system that actually creates like that. And in addition, there are many, many other, like challenges. So that's a little bit of where we are. Like, so just to give a reflection that we are advancing, that is achieved. A lot of like organizations are like really, really keen to move this agenda and these objectives like forward, but there is still a lot to do. So I think the COP declaration arrives in such a good time to also help us to move the anticipatory action agenda in conflict settings. So with that, like how do you think, Helena, like the COP declaration links with anticipatory action, like how this is contributing to many of us that are here in this conversation today and the ones who are gonna listen to the conversation after? So tell us your opinion on this.
Yeah, well, I'm personally quite hopeful that the declaration provides a hook to really advance this work even more, because there are a lot of efforts already ongoing as well. And I think this is also important to recognize for many policymakers, that this is we're not starting from scratch. There are certain barriers that are still in place. It's not easy. There are a lot of challenges, but it's also possible. We just need to really put our minds to it and put finance to it as well. So I was actually, when you were speaking, Catalina, I was thinking of something that a government official from Somalia was actually outlining very clearly during a reading that I attended. And he really described it very well. He said, like, look, in the government, we are focused on emergency humanitarian issues. And the government machinery is really responding from crisis to crisis, which doesn't really allow for more strategic long-term thinking. They're just super occupied with like moving from one crisis to the other. So this is also really a crisis, both conflict and climate crisis, but very much also climate crisis, floods, droughts, you name it. I think we're all quite aware of what's going on in Somalia, which is also really undermining progress on, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, but also broader peace. So I think like this is such a good reason to focus more on like predicting that a shock or a climate shock will occur, facilitating proper responses. So really building this into provide some room to focus on more longer term structures instead of moving from one crisis to the other. So I'm really hoping that in terms of if I look at the declaration itself, there's this second pillar that focuses very strongly on practice and programming. So this is really where we can zoom in on like what is currently working in fragile and conflict affected settings in terms of anticipatory action and early warning systems in particular. What can we scale up and how can we do more? Because I do think that still we're seeing whenever there are like large scale pilots in this field as well, they usually don't focus on fragile conflict affected context, whereas there is actually a critical opportunity to do that. And one could also argue that if you're able to roll out such a system in a fragile setting, then it's very likely that you might be able to do the same in a stable setting, whereas the other way around is obviously more tricky. So I think this is actually really a critical opportunity. And I also really liked you mentioning refugee or IDP camps, because I think that's actually one of those settings that usually, or we used to think like, okay, that's a short-term thing, so short-term humanitarian aid, but we also know that this is no longer the case. Climate change is here to stay. Many of these settlements are also here to stay. So this is maybe a bit of a more stable kind of setting that that provides very good entry points for enhanced rollout of anticipatory action systems and responses. And what we do see, so one of the positive developments, I think, is the early warning systems for all initiative, that in its initial rollout in 30 countries is already quite focused on fragile and conflict affected contexts. And I think there's a real effort being made there as well in terms of evaluating, okay, what is needed, how are these contexts different from other developing contexts, What do we need to do more of? What do we need to adjust in terms of our policy and practice? So a lot of movement, and hopefully the declaration will really continue to provide this hook for all of these different actors to refer to in terms of advancing this work even more.
Great. And when you were just speaking, something came to my mind with relation to like how to advance anticipatory action for displaced populations affected by conflict, and something very interesting happened in COP26. When COP26 happened in Glasgow, the UK government, I mean, kind of in a way, had a little bit of a focus on like how do we support climate action for displaced populations at that time, and it was a very general. But a very fascinating move that happened afterwards is that one of the biggest climate services and weather services investments of the UK government through the UK Met Office for the MENA region is now focusing on how to bring anticipatory action for displaced populations. And I think that's just such a great example of how from a political statement, at COP, it really kind of like moved into a more kind of tangible, practical, financing for this. So there is a massive program at the moment. I don't know if any of you is aware, it's called the Wiser MENA program, and it's exclusively focused on how to bring early warning action for displaced populations in particular countries in the Middle East. So that's like it's also a nice example of like, yeah, there's some like I'm a very optimistic person, so I think we feel that there are some like really like good progress. Maybe a question on this, because now of course we're going to have a transition to COP29 Azerbaijan. In terms of anticipatory action, do you see any kind of interest on this topic? Is it part of the discussions, maybe through the working groups that you mentioned before? I mean, do you think that this is going to continue as a part of the momentum?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful that it will. I can't speak on behalf of the COP29 presidency, but from our conversations and from those conversations, we do definitely see a continued focus on this topic. So there are plans to organize. So we organized as COP28 a thematic day on relief, recovery, and peace. So very much including the fragile and conflict-affected context focus, but also a little bit broader, including anticipatory action, humanitarian system efforts more broadly. And there's definitely a lot of interest from the COP29 presidency to continue that focus. And I know they are discussing hosting either a half or a full day that is focused on peace and security related matters. So I definitely think it's here to stay. From our point of view, we've also put specific reference in the declaration itself. So the countries and organizations that endorse the declaration basically committed to gathering again at COP29 and discussing progress and initiating further action. So that's also something that you can expect from our side at COP29.
Good. I think that's really fantastic. And I think from the anticipation hub perspective, this is just such a good timing, because as Marius mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, this year focus on our dialogue platform that brings like more than 500 people and more than 2,000 people online will have as well a focus on complexities of like risk and like this intersection of compound risk, including conflict as one of the elements. So I think it will be very important definitely to kind of strategize and see, okay, how through this space and the outcomes that will come after that, we can connect with the work that you will be doing, because I think it's, like we need to be all very unified and join forces in all these efforts. So you're super welcome to join us in Berlin in October, and anybody, in this conversation today, you're all super invited to join that as well. So just a quick just update in terms of like where we are on the anticipatory action in conflict, like a space. And I think for me, as I mentioned, like, it's quite close to my heart, because I'm finishing a PhD on this topic. And I think like some of the key learnings that have come through these last years of analysis and like working with many stakeholders are kind of interesting, like kind of important. I think one big element is that despite the fact that in many of these contexts there is a lack of hydromet infrastructure, where there is basically like limitations on the capacity of national hydromet services to produce forecasts that could be reliable, where we can have like all the information that we wish we could have. Despite of that, there is really an opportunity to tap into like the global models that are out there. So I think that like one of my papers like really focus on understanding at what extent we could use global forecast models to be able to anticipate crisis in conflict settings. And I think that that is definitely something very important. I think many organizations are definitely really trying to figure it out how we can use all that power of these global models, because we cannot have the excuse, to say that we don't have a forecast in this area, because we know that it could be used. So I think that's one element that I think is very encouraging as well. I mean, of course, there is a big element that we need to continue doing that sustainable investment on a hydromet infrastructure and the capacities of the national hydromet services in this particular context, because we need those observations in the ground. We need that capacity. So maybe on that note, Helena, like I know it's very niche and it's like really zooming into a very detailed topic, but is this, or has this been part of any of your discussions? So like what extent, climate finances can continue supporting this hydrometeorological capacity and infrastructure in countries, that do not have necessarily all the capacities at this moment?
So it hasn't been a particular focus of discussion, but that doesn't mean that it cannot be. I think it's actually a great example of getting more concrete in terms of implementing the objectives of the declaration. And I do think also this community really has a big role to play in emphasizing that this is a particular area that also the funders could focus on in terms of climate finance. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in this space. Because what we sometimes notice is, yes, there's political momentum with the declaration. Yes, there's a strong programming and good practice focus. Yes, there's a finance focus. But what indeed exactly are we going to finance? If it's not like large infrastructure projects, so what is it then? So then you enter the space of like food and water security. But I think this is actually a critical entry point that I'd love to continue brainstorming on this to see how we can insert this a little bit more.
I'm happy to do that. I think that is one aspect that I think is super fascinating. And I think another one which might resonate to some of the people here in this conversation that might be very involved into projects is that, and this is for a recent paper that I'm going to publish hopefully very soon, is like one of the big findings, which is not rocket science, is that to really be able to do early action in some of these extremely complex contexts, local actors are the key. Like they are the one who will be able to go and actually deliver and do the action. And I think the current system and the current kind of machinery that we have on the anticipatory action systems is not fully fit for purpose for that. Because when I'm talking about local actors, is like really that local Red Cross branch or the local community group that, has the knowledge and the intel of the dynamics of conflict, or even, the role of the church within that. So I think that it's a big shift on how do we make sure that those communities and people and individuals that are really there, able to do things, are empowered, and that are, that they receive all the support that is needed to that. So that's another big gap. And it's, of course, very aligned with the whole localization agenda and that process. But I think it's a very obvious gap that is out there that needs to be sorted out. Yeah, any thoughts on that one?
I fully agree on that one. And I think what is also very important is that we include like local perceptions, and that we don't just, also specifically at COPs or in solution-oriented conversations, that we don't just put light on UN agencies or on other international actors, but that we really hear from from local populations. And this is also something that we really try to achieve at COP28. But we can certainly do a lot more of it, and we need a lot more of it, I would say. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I think, many of us are really committed to this and trying to figure out really at the end how the people that is in the ground doing the early action has all the capacities and everything that they need to be able to do it. With that, I would love to open the floor to anybody who wants to make a comment or ask a question or, share your experience. It will be just like really lovely. If you can just open your mic, feel free to jump in, or if you want to write on the chat. So I'm going to give you a few minutes if you want to, be brave. Okay, nice. Stephanie, I can see. What mechanisms can donors adopt to allow funds for AA in conflict? Okay. Oh, this is fascinating. For example, the locust infestation in Sudan in 2020 was completely predictable and in fact was anticipated by many humanitarian actors in the ground, yet very few was able to secure funding. Any thoughts on that? Because that's very related, definitely, with a lot of your conversations on the financing mechanisms.
Yeah, no, it is. And it's a very good question that I think a lot of actors are grappling with. We actually had a few conversations in terms of whether there was a possibility to push for specific targets for anticipatory action funding allocations in advance of COP28. That didn't really go anywhere because it was difficult to have like one broad target. But for governments individually, it's definitely possible to allocate a specific amount of money to respond in advance of disasters. And there are also several funds that are targeted to do this. So that's another key opportunity, I think, for governments to put their money in. And also very related to this, one other effort that we did at COP28 was also rallying political support around a charter for early finance in response to disasters. So not just focused on fragile and conflict affected communities, a little bit broader. But in that context, we also saw some commitment that definitely from quite a few donors to do better at this. So there are a few like funding mechanisms specifically, but they can also very much integrate this into their own policy structures. And we do actually see that a little bit more recently, including with the UK, I think Germany. There are a few other examples of specific governments that are embarking on this effort.
Yes.
Particularly important, yeah.
Even the World Bank as well is kind of looking within their kind of pool funding, like this regional funding, like CDRIF, CADRIF, that they're also looking into that, like how that can be expanded into having kind of like an anticipatory action window, which I think is also very positive. So we have some people. Annelien, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks so much for the interesting conversation. Hi, Catalina. Hi, Helena. So I'm Annelien Vos from the International Rescue Committee. I'm a senior policy advisor also working on climate finance issues. Maybe two questions from my side. So it's really fascinating to hear about the progress since the declaration. And I hear in particular, Helena, you were giving some examples from the Vertical Climate Fund. I wonder if you also see sort of similar progress more from like the MDB or the bilateral side of things as well, or sort of anything in particular related to packages of solutions that were put forward. Are they thinking about sort of some specific mechanism to maybe report on the commitments under that? And then also more broadly I wonder what your view is sort of on the discussions within the new climate finance goal within the NCQG. I mean, from what I understand for the moment, it's still it's very difficult discussion. So it doesn't go into that detail of finance for fragile and conflict affected states specifically. But we did see, at least in the output paper from the bond discussions, they are sort of mentioned already as a category next to least developed countries and small island development states as well. So I wonder if you have thoughts on how that could progress. I know some some are in favor of a specific category, and at IRC we're arguing for a target as well. But yeah, I wonder what your views are on that. Thanks.
Great questions. So yes, definitely we also see a lot of momentum within the MDBs. Specifically, the Islamic Development Bank made an announcement as indeed part of the package of solutions under the declaration that they would allocate 1 billion of climate finance to their members that are affected by fragility and conflict. Overall, well, many of them participated actually in the Abu Dhabi focused workshop that happened in June. So there's definitely a lot of momentum in terms of both individually within the banks, increasing alignment between their fragility departments and between their climate departments, but cross-cutting to see like what can we do collectively and jointly. And this is a bit more complicated for the MDBs to do when you compare it to the climate funds are the four biggest climate funds, but a lot of momentum there as well. And on the package of solutions, so we're not really going to focus on some of the individual commitments that were made by organizations and governments. But this is one of the reasons that we are very much providing this space at COP29 for all of these actors to demonstrate. So this is what we did individually, because the package of solutions was basically comprised of individual contributions. And now what are we going to do collectively? So is there something that we can agree on concretely that we can do to move the needle forward collectively? And we, of course, also provide the opportunity, and whenever we speak with organizations or governments that have committed to the package of solutions, we, of course, are very interested in hearing what progress they are making. The NCQG is a very important one as well. I can't say too much about it, but since I haven't been involved very closely in those conversations, but I do indeed know that in the provisional documents, there were or are references to countries and communities affected by fragility and conflict. It's very much the question on whether this will hold. I don't want to be too skeptical because I'm also a very optimistic person, but I do know it's very complicated in the context of the negotiations. Specifically, the perception of trying to create a new category is very tricky within the COP context. So what our approach has been is really to focus on the need to not exclude them unintentionally from accessing specific finance and funding and benefiting from efforts that are related to the COP process. So this is a little bit of a different angle, but I'm very curious to see, I think like all of us, where this is gonna end up. The attention is there and the language is trickling in indeed.
Yeah, we need to stay tuned for that. Me too. I'm like very curious to see how this is going to unfold and what it's going to bring. So there is like a mix of skepticism and also kind of optimism. So yeah, I think let's stay tuned for that. I will pass the floor to Nestor. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the super interesting conversation. I think, can you hear me okay? Yes.
Perfect.
Good. I'm Nestor from the OECD. I work on the risk governance portfolio in the OECD. And one of the topics that we're working quite actively on is how to understand the gap between the infrastructure that is needed to produce sort of renewable energy and how that is kind of creating the space for action to not only to build it, but actually to protect it. And I wonder if any of this conversation is actually touching on the conversations that you're having on fragility and conflict settings, because it's not just in sort of high-income countries that this infrastructure needs to be built, because the gap is everywhere, right? So how much of this discussion, not just about investing in infrastructure, Catalina, you mentioned this was already part of the conversations early on, but about protecting the infrastructure that you invest in and how to use anticipatory action to better mobilize the systems to protect that infrastructure once the investment has happened. Is this a conversation at all? Is this like 4 steps ahead, or is it actually like really good stuff happening already in this space?
So you touch on a topic that I'm really interested. Like I have been trying to figure it out because it's a big puzzle. So Helena, you might have your ideas. I'll jump and say, Nestor, I think I have been looking into this from a hydrometeorological perspective investment, because I think one of the big issues that that we face within kind of like early warning action community in these very, you know, extreme kind of fragile and conflict settings is that we can have like big investments and like hydrometer stations, like all different type of communications infrastructure, but in a context of insecurity, anything can happen, and this could be just like easily destroyed, which means that basically investment, you know, down the drain, if they are not either, or if they are directly attacked, or if they are just not maintained properly because of lack of access and so on and so forth. So this applies to any type of infrastructure, but what I have been looking is mostly at that kind of hydromet infrastructure. So one of the things that my team have been looking at is that at the potential how these particular infrastructure can be protected under international humanitarian law. And I think there is a massive space there to work, particularly with the ICRC and like and other actors that are like more focused on the protection of critical infrastructure, to really kind of enhance or maybe broaden the scope of protection, because normally it's focused on the hospitals and the schools and like, you know, like the traditional classical infrastructure. But the thing that I have been looking quite a lot is that, well, I mean, climate-related infrastructure is so important, not only because of the short term of being able to provide weather forecasts, but because in the long term, we need climate observations to try to understand, you know, what are going to be the better models of climate in the next, I don't know, 20, 30, 50 years. So I think there is an urgent need of like, how do we protect our investments? And it is, so basically, Nestor, just to say, this is so new, and we're working as we speak on a kind of like research, like agenda, but like a proper research document that we want to put out there to really start this conversation. So I think will be just wonderful. You know, we can kind of continue this discussion. I think OECD, you play such a key role on this. So happy to follow up on this bilaterally. But I think, Helena, because of all the background that, you know, not only in your current position, but all what you have done in the past, what do you think about this? Like about that need of like protection of this infrastructure?
It's a super interesting issue, very, very relevant, I think. It actually hasn't come up too much in our conversations, although I do have to say that recently, specifically in the food security meeting that we hosted in with Rome-based agencies, there were quite a few government representatives from fragile and conflict-affected contexts present who touched upon this issue and who said, look, we have a lot of potential in terms of renewable energy, but we do need the investment. And if we don't invest now, we miss the boat, or actually we've already missed the boat. But then this is actually one of the key issues that comes up when you start those conversations with funders. They say, look, we're not going to invest. That's way too risky to invest in the country and to invest in that infrastructure if we don't know if it will still be there and functioning in a couple of years' time. So it's a very tricky issue, especially because there's a lot of money and effort involved in these large projects. So I don't have super clear insights on this. Other than that, I think it's very relevant and that we should definitely look into this. So happy to learn more about it if you have any documents that you're working on specifically.
I think from us, it's so new as well. But this is good. I think it just shows that it's a good space because it's a hard question and it's an important one. So I think it's a good space to be looking at least from our perspective. So I definitely would welcome anyone else who wants to join the conversation to just get in touch.
That, Nelson, brings me to the end of the conversation. I just want to do some like key highlights that are important maybe for all of you. I know we are 3 minutes ahead, but like, just bear with me. So at the moment, a couple of things that are evolving in this space for you all to be like tuned in. So in addition of the working group that I mentioned earlier, that is trying to move different, particular kind of working groups on a variety of topics, like for instance, anticipatory action in cities affected by conflict, or anticipatory action for people affected by conflict, but with a health lens. So there are these variety of topics that are evolving in this space. There is one big thing that we're working on at the moment with the CGIAR, and particularly with EMI. We are developing an anticipatory action in conflict toolkit. And the idea is really to bring a lot of these things that we are talking about within that toolkit. For example, this issue of infrastructure protection within that toolkit, because we see the gap of kind of like knowledge and understanding of a lot of the practitioners that are out there implementing these type of projects. And I think this with basically joining forces between the Climate Center and CGIAR, we want to contribute to address that gap. So stay tuned for that. We will share more information through our newsletters, but I think if you want to participate, it would be great also for you to be part of these. And then the last thing, again, our dialogue platform in October is gonna really focus on these topics, so you're super welcome to join. It's gonna be really, really lovely space for networking and conversations in Berlin. So with that, I want to thank you, Helena. This has been super lovely. I really, really enjoy very much. I feel that we need to do more of this. And I wish you all the best in the next few months as you prepare for the transition to the COP29 Azerbaijan. And I'm pretty sure that we will continue in contact down the line. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining. I hope that you enjoy the conversation, and if you want to reach out, just please send us an email at the Anticipation Hub, and we will continue the conversation. So thank you, Helena.
Thank you so much.
All the best. Bye, everyone. Bye.